she did this. What the hell is she? Now, what did she do to you? She infected us with her gift. That's what she calls it. I found her near a busted out tanker in the bayou. Everything changed after that.
So she infects you and then she takes control?
No. Not exactly, son. She just... She forces her way into your mind, your soul. You can't fight back. You are connected to her, and you can't resist the urge to... Oh, you're a different person after that.
The Baker family is pretty much synonymous with Resident Evil 7. Though Ethan Winters served as the game's protagonist, though the Molded and Eveline were the primary antagonists, and though there were plenty of typical Resident Evil shadowy corporate dealings going on in the story behind the scenes, the Bakers were, without the shadow of a doubt, the real stars of the show. Before we go ahead, a quick request. We upload new videos every single day, and your subscription matters a lot. So please consider subscribing and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. With that out of the way, let's begin. By the time the credits roll on Resident Evil 7 and its DLCs, a couple of the Bakers are still alive, at least one of whom has strong ties to Ethan Winters, who will once again be the central protagonist in the next game. But even if those surviving Bakers don't make an appearance in Resident Evil Village, given how closely their story is tied to some of the larger narrative arcs that the series is likely going to continue going forward, it's obvious that the Bakers are still going to be an important part of Resident Evil's story, either directly or indirectly. And so, with Village on the horizon, here we're going to refresh our memories about the Bakers and their stories. Until 2014, the Bakers were, by and large, a rather ordinary family, though not completely so. There was Jack Baker, the patriarch, who served in the Marine Corps when he was young. Jack also had a brother, Joe, who was also in the military in his younger days, though the two had a pretty fierce sibling rivalry going on, which, on at least a few occasions, had even grown violent. By the time the events of Resident Evil 7 take place, Joe wasn't really in contact with the rest of the Baker family and lived as a hermit in the swamps close to their house. Then there was Marguerite, Jack's wife, and their two children, their son Lucas and their daughter Zoe. Of all the Bakers, if there was one member of the family who could be described as a bad seed long before the events of RE7 even kicked off, it would be Lucas. Unhinged and cruel, Lucas was not the most stable, mentally speaking, even from a very young age, though he was also a very gifted inventor. Often, however, he would use those two elements as a deadly combination, such as when, as a child, he trapped one of his bullies, Oliver, in the attic of his house, and then sealed him in there with an electric lock that he had invented, letting him starve to death. In 2014, the Bakers led a mostly ordinary life, living on a large estate in Dulve, Louisiana. That, of course, changed when the tanker Annabelle crashed into the swamps nearby following a storm, prompting Jack and Lucas to head out into the swamps and survey the wreckage, a decision that would in the long run go on to cost them their lives. Lucas came back with an unconscious Mia Winters in tow, who was secretly an agent of the criminal syndicate The Connections. She had been traveling aboard the tanker under the guise of the mother of a young girl named Eveline, who was actually a bioweapon made by Mia's employers, and had the ability to control minds and create monsters made of mold. And as luck would have it, shortly after Lucas's return to the Baker's residence, Jack came back as well, with Eveline. Since Mia was unconscious and had already been infected by Eveline, she was unable to warn the Bakers about her true nature. Eveline, who desperately searched for familial connections, proceeded to quickly infect the entire Baker family, controlling their minds and forcing them to see her as a member of their own family. All but one. You see, while Eveline was wreaking havoc in the house and slowly bringing the Bakers under her control one by one, Zoe managed to make a run for it and decided to hide out in her trailer outside the main house. Here, she found an unconscious Mia, as well as a letter that explained in detail what Eveline was and what she was capable of. Eveline did manage to catch Zoe and infect her not long afterward, but since she was fully aware what it was and what her abilities had allowed her to infect her with, Zoe managed to retain her individuality and full control of her mental faculties. Over the next few years, Zoe isolated herself from her family, who went on to do atrocious things under Eveline's control. Zoe decided to spend most of her time in her trailer, where the Bakers were happy to let her stay, knowing that she was infected with what they called Evelyn's gift. Zoe did try to escape on a few occasions, and even took steps to try and cure herself, but was stopped by her family every time. The entire family withdrew from community life altogether. Meanwhile, during these years, the Bakers also began abducting tourists and homeless people while under Evelyn's control in attempts to add more members to their new family. These attempts would invariably fail, leading to the abductees being killed, tortured, or turned into one of the Molded. Thanks to Evelyn's infection, the Baker family members gained regenerative abilities, superhuman strength, and in Marguerite's case, the ability to produce and control giant and mutated insects. Not long after the Bakers were possessed by Evelyn, though, one of them managed to break free of her control. Lucas was contacted and then eventually recruited by the Connections, who, as we mentioned earlier, were the organization who created Evelyn in the first place. The Connections provided Lucas with the serum that freed him of her control, and recruited him to spy on his family and on Evelyn for them. The Connections sent more researchers to aid Lucas and set up a lab in the salt mines close to the Bakers' residence. Lucas, who had successfully managed to fool Evelyn into believing that he was still under her control, was eventually made a head researcher by the Connections, though his association with them would be short-lived. Wanting to be free of his employers, Lucas betrayed the Connections, trapping his fellow researchers in a room and having them all killed by the Molded. We'll get back to what he goes on to do after that in a bit, so keep him in mind. Meanwhile, in 2017, Evelyn set her sights on Mia's husband, Ethan Winters, and wanting to add him to her family made Mia contact him, telling him to come find her in Dulve. Ethan, who had believed his wife to be dead for 3 years, dropped everything and went to Louisiana. Ethan proved to be a thorn in Evelyn's side and was entirely resistant to becoming a new member of her family, even tussling with Mia in the process. That tussle led to him losing his hand, and though he managed to subdue Mia in a fight nonetheless, he was eventually knocked unconscious by Jack. During this time, Zoe reattached his severed hand back to his body, and after he woke up, she contacted him through several phone calls over the course of the following night, helping him take the Bakers down one by one and find a cure for herself and for Mia. Ethan had much better luck against the Bakers than they initially thought he would. He fought back against Jack on multiple occasions, with their final confrontation seemingly killing him. He fought against Marguerite and conclusively killed her. He went up against Lucas, and though they never directly fought each other, Ethan managed to outsmart him on multiple occasions, before Lucas decided to flee from the Baker residence and hide out in the mines nearby. Forced by circumstances and tough choices, Ethan was forced to leave a still infected Zoe behind while he and Mia were rescued from the Baker residence by a team of Blue Umbrella, a private military organization dedicated to cleaning up the messes left behind by the original Umbrella Corporation. Ethan requested the Blue Umbrella Squad, which was led by Chris Redfield, to keep an eye out for Zoe Baker, provide her with a cure, and get her out once and for all. Before we talk about Zoe, though, let's get back to Lucas for just a bit. Because as it turns out, Lucas, owing to his connection to, well, the Connections, he became a chief target for Blue Umbrella and for Chris Redfield. Chris headed down into the mines to hunt Lucas, who, now having betrayed the Connections, was preparing to sell all of the information he had on Evelyn and the E-type bioweapon to an unknown third party. After many trials and tribulations, Chris managed to catch up with Lucas. After a dramatic fight in which a bullet from Chris triggered the virus within Lucas and turned him into a mutated monster, Chris manages to kill Lucas and destroyed his computer so that his data could not be transferred to the mysterious, unknown third party. Which means we're now down to 2 Bakers, Zoe and Joe. Or are we? Well, as it turns out, Jack Baker, who had refused to die after multiple seemingly conclusive lethal blows throughout all of Resident Evil 7, still was not dead. No, with Evelyn now dead, Jack had mutated further and turned into a mutated creature entirely of its own, called the Swamp Man. Zoe, meanwhile, had been calcified weeks ago by Evelyn as punishment for helping Ethan and Mia. Soon, she was found in the swamps in her calcified state by Blue Umbrella forces, but not long afterward, she and the soldiers with her were apprehended by her uncle, Joe Baker. Joe, who had been living as a hermit in the swamps for years, had no inkling about everything that had gone down at the Baker residence over the last few years, and had taken to surviving in the swamps while fighting back against the Molded without knowing what they were or where they were coming from. Initially believing that Blue Umbrella soldiers were responsible for the Molded and for Zoe's state, Joe was initially not the friendliest face that they would have hoped to see. He was soon given the location of a shack where they had a cure prepped for Zoe. Determined to save his niece, Joe headed out to the shack and returned with the cure, only to find it burning. To add to his troubles, once he administered the cure, he found it to be ineffective. The soldier explained to Joe that the cure was only a partial dose, with the remainder kept in a base nearby. Before they could head out, however, they were attacked by none other than the Swamp Man, who Joe didn't know was actually his brother Jack. While the Swamp Man ripped the soldier in half, Joe grabbed Zoe and fled from the scene on a boat, heading out to the base to look for the remainder of that cure. Now, a lot happened after that, but rather than going into the nitty-gritties and the full details of all the events portrayed in RE7's End of Zoe DLC, let's just talk about the important bits, the ending, by which point Joe knows that the Swamp Man is none other than his brother Jack, or what remains of him anyway. The end of Zoe's conclusion sees Joe and Jack squaring off in a climactic duel back at the Baker residence, where Joe is able to kill Jack once and for all, freeing him from his miserable existence, before finally administering the full cure to Zoe to free her from Evelyn's infection. Not long afterward, Chris Redfield and his team arrive at the Baker residence once more to secure the area and safely escort Joe and Zoe away from the scene.
Someone wants to speak to you.
Zoe. Zoe, are you there?
It's you. I don't believe it. You actually made it.
We both did.
You didn't forget about me.
I told you I'd send help, and I always keep my promises.
Thank you, Ethan.
Heading into Resident Evil Village, it's hard to know how much of a role the surviving Bakers will have to play. Joe and Zoe may still make an appearance, the latter especially seeing as she forms a strong bond with Ethan during the course of RE7, and may still have a role to play in his story in Village. Meanwhile, the connections are obviously going to be an important part of the RE story going forward, while the mysterious third party that Lucas was trying to deal with before his death is also most likely an important narrative element that will come into play in the future. One way or another, the Bakers are going to have some sort of a presence in Resident Evil Village's story. We just have to wait to find out how much of a presence that will be. Thankfully, we don't have to wait too long to find out. And with that, we reached the end of the video. Have anything to say? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we upload new videos every single day on Gaming Bolt, so please consider subscribing as it really helps us out. Thanks for watching.